Good evening. My name is Ihsan Hines. Welcome to another edition of MBKCares Wellness Wednesday. This is episode 13, and it'll actually be the final episode of season number 1. We'll resume on Wednesday, July the 29th. I'm excited about today's episode. We're going to be joined by special guest Christopher Rogers from the Paul Robeson House. He's the director of the program there, and he'll be helping us along with this discussion about American independence and African American freedom. I'll be part moderating alongside Eric Marsh from the Father and Circle on MBK Cares. Eric, if you want to introduce yourself and then our guest.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here again with us on Wellness Wednesday. Tonight's conversation, we're going to be focusing on some pieces of African American history, but specifically starting with a conversation with Chris about the Paul Robeson House and his connection to it. And then we'll be going into our conversation about the contrast between Juneteenth the contrast between Juneteenth and July 4th and what that means for African Americans. So welcome, Chris Rogers. Please give us an introduction to tell us about yourself.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you all for having me. I've definitely seen this program more than once on my timeline. So thank you all. Really excited to be here. I'm Christopher Rogers. I've been trying to do like the Christopher R. Rogers. So I know many Chris Rogers out there. And I'm the program director at the Paul Robeson House and Museum, which is located at the corner of 50th and Walnut. I'm from Chester. Been in the city since like 2012, 2013. And it's been a great week. A busy week, but we've been feeling the love out there from the folks and a lot of recognition out there.
Excellent. So tell us about this week. Like what's been significant about this week for the Robeson House?
Yeah, so we've always been, and I've been in particular in constant conversation with the Colored Girls Museum out of West Germantown, led by Vashti Dubois. And we're both two small Black arts organizations, both sort of trying to, growing in our sustainability, growing in our vision, but always in relationship to like Black movements and sort of like Black cultural production throughout Philadelphia. And we were thinking about, what it will take for us to, reopen safely, and what our sort of like needs are, especially as the cultural fund, the cuts to Philly Cultural Fund, and seeing just the lack of resources and for the Black community in particular, but also like the arts community. So we put a call together that was really about naming the things that we need and saying, let's just be public about it. And we did that maybe about 8-9 days ago with a call for like the PPE equipment, sanitizer stuff, and then sort of stepping it up a little bit with some of our infrastructural needs. At the Robeson House, it's like accessibility and renovating the sort of like kitchen at one of our buildings. And we put a goal on it. Like we thought like a very lofty, almost, impossible goal. Sometimes you feel like we want to raise $100,000. And 2 days in, we had raised $5,000. 5 days in, it was at $50,000. Yeah. And this is like day 8 or 9, and we're approaching like $98,000 of the goal. And it has not only like lifted up our campaign and our needs and show people like this sort of like treasure, and we feel so affirmed by the love that's out there, but we're also like, we see this as a beginning to a much larger conversation about Black museums, Black memory, and how we like invest in that, across this country, and like in particular relationship to like this reckoning with racism and injustice happening throughout the country right now.
Yes. I'm so happy to hear that, because I just saw the news about, the call that you guys have put out within the past 48 hours. And so I shared it. And one of my things that I shared was like, hey, allies, if you really about it, put your money where your mouth is. And I'm so happy to hear that people have actually stepped up. And I think, what you just said raises an interesting point for me, right? Because I think, isn't it interesting, right? How we're in a time where we are talking about tearing down monuments to historical figures. And many people have said a lot of these monuments and things that are being torn down, if we were to keep them at all, actually belong in museums. And so what kind of world are we living now? Like, how do you envision like being able to translate or utilize that movement where we are understanding our history in a different way, where we're tearing down Confederate monuments? And how can we translate that movement into supporting African-American museums and other culturally relevant institutions?
Yeah, I think, I definitely sort of like welcome our way of like looking at what are the sort of like symbols and institutions that we invest in that sort of identify, as society sort of like principles or morality, in a sense. And I think, just to really ground it in what the WPCA stands for, and as just my experience, and I came on pretty late.
Tell us what that stands for.
2015. So WPCA is the West Philadelphia Cultural Alliance, which was founded by Francis Alston, a community librarian, in 1984, who was working sort of like in communication with some city folks around like, how are we like lifting up culture specific to West Philadelphia neighborhoods, and specific to the Black community there. And her work in her mind of the Alliance, I was just talking to the folks at the Bushfire Theater about this, right? Was like, we have amazing art assets within our West Philadelphia community. And sometimes they are like invisibilized or erased from the city landscape. Sometimes they are not supported as they should. They don't get the sort of like philanthropic funding that they should. But at the same time, these are like beloved spaces for the Black community there. And that abundance of love and, commitment that we feel from our folks is what keeps us going. So one of the things that happened is in 1985, after the tragic sort of MOVE bombing, the WPCA held a week-long arts festival that featured over 100 different arts organizations that was saying like, we need to create a space of healing for our community, right? And I always come back to that story, because I think that how we create spaces of healing, right, is sort of like what we stand for, right? So that work started in 84 and 85, right? But then when the Paul Robeson House comes together in like the early 90s, and the Robeson's legacy as being people who stood not only to confront racism in this country, but also think about our relationship as Black folks to movements across the African continent, to think about our relationship to world systems such as, socialism and communism, and what that could mean for the type of, visions of freedom, the type of, life-sustaining distribution of resources that we could create. And that too is healing, right? That too is thinking of like how our past, or the Sankofa principle of how our past informs our sort of like future visions. And so we sort of ground ourselves in that work, right? And I think in particular, it is a ongoing conversation that we have at the house about what this American project is, right? And our relationship to it. And I think that's why this conversation was also dope to be able to show up for and think about,
Yeah, no, appreciate that, because you just summed up a whole, the component, right? Ihsan, we were talking about this for the past 2 weeks about, that American experiment, right? And so I'm just yeah, that's dope. That's dope. I'm not sure how much time you had, but what I wanted to do was have you share with us a little bit about, like, you said you're from Chester. So what got you involved and connected to the Robeson House?
Yeah, that's dope. So yeah, I'm from Chester, which I consider a much different place than Philadelphia. People always ask me when I was coming up, they would say, yo, but you grew up around here. And I'm like, nah,
Yeah.
it's,
Nah,
it's different. I mean,
it
I
ain't
went
the
to the
same.
gallery a couple times. You know, I might went to a few nightclubs when I was like 17 to 18, but overall, nah.
Yeah.
But I came to the city when I was working on my master's degree at Penn and in education. And I've always been somebody, like my mom was a school teacher in Chester, and I was like one of those program kids, you know, that, you know, every week or something I was placed in some, you know what I mean, I was in this camp, this thing, this program. My brother played a lot of basketball, so we was so connected to like community groups and community institutions. So when I got into the city, and I happened to live right at the corner of 19th and Diamond, the Church of the Advocate was like one of those immediate places that was
Mm.
there, and I sort of seen how, oh, this is how people come together in Philly, you know, particularly with a North Philadelphia flavor to it.
Yeah.
And then like around 2015, with my sort of like connections to educational organizing and like Black history, I saw there was an event over at the Paul Robeson House that focused on just like where do we go from here, and it happened to be like in the wake of Frances Austin's passing. She
Mm.
passed in September 2015, and the sort of like event was led by Miss Renoka Michael, and it was like, we're here and we're going to keep this place going, and what happens next. So I started sort of like there, got to meet some folks, would come back for other things, ended up like, oh, let me try out something. Let's host an event. Let's do this. And then that turned into another thing. That turned
Mhm.
into another thing. Next thing you know, I've been deemed the program director, and I sort of take that title with pride, and you know, feel a responsibility to the West Philadelphia sort of like cultural workers, you know, and the different,
Yeah.
you know, Hakeem's bookstore, the many different spaces that are there about how we, you know, align ourselves and build towards a vision of Black freedom, if you will.
Yeah. Yo, that's dope. I keep saying it. I feel like I'm going to keep saying that during this conversation because I'm a new transplant to West Philadelphia. I don't know if you know that or not, but you know, I just moved into West Philadelphia within the past, you know, year and a half, 2 years. And so not being really aware of the West Philadelphia Cultural Alliance, but knowing Philadelphia, it's interesting how you say, you know, Philly's not Chester. So I wonder if it takes someone from who's not from Philly to appreciate what Philadelphia has in terms of Black history and Black cultural components.
I mean, I wouldn't think so. I think, and I think me in particular, like my relationship to Chester, is people would say the same. We feel that same energy around uh, what happens in Chester in terms of like Chester culture. But I think
Uh-huh.
I'm always one to like reiterate that there are, you know, many different communities of Black cultural sort of like production that
Hmm.
go like that's in some ways underground and strategically underground for the right reasons. Because I mean, if you think about just Philly hip hop and our Philly hip hop community and our Philly sort of like hip hop institutions, the people they put on, right? But at the same time, is there a particular place in which that is sort of like held or archived, or it's networked, right? And it's happened through the streets, and that's how the streets continues to own it, right? In terms
Hmm.
of like, you know what I mean, Gilly and the state property. Like, there's so many. I'm a hip hop person, so that always comes up for me. Of like, there we have our cultural communities here, and
Hmm.
we have that cultural production here. But there's also, yeah, and here's another great example. I was talking with Bushfire the other day about the coalition. So in the '90s, there was a coalition of Black cultural organizations, which featured Odunde, the WPCA,
Hmm.
Bushfire Theater, Mill Creek, Kulu Mele, the African American Museum of Philadelphia.
Uh-huh.
This coalition of Black cultural organizations, they put in work, right? And
Yeah.
they reached a point, they came together to get funding, you know, from, you know, particular organizations and continue on their work and refine one another and how they went about it. And that network is still there. I mean, the coalition doesn't exist as a building, as a space anymore, but that network of cultural folks are still there. And then when we think about the sort of like landscape of like the city and the city support and the funding and all that, it's all connected in there. And so I think one of the fundraisers part of the fundraiser conversation that we're having with the Colored Girls Museum is where exactly is the Black arts organization, representation in terms of, like for example, African American Museum luckily got their funding restored to like 200,000, but then Mural Arts I think got something more than $1 million. I think the Philadelphia Museum of Art got like $2 million. So let's talk about like what our Black arts organizations really need and how they need to be invested in to really thrive. If we're serious about saying, Black Lives Matter and we want racial equity and all this sort of like ways that we talk about those things.
That is fascinating to me because, I think about what you just said about the funding sources that were restored, right? After COVID-19 budget cuts, everybody thought the world was going to end and, city didn't have any money, any revenue, and we were going to be eating, beans out of can. And so to hear that those white institutions and the amount of money that they received compared to the African American Museum is drastically different. What do you think happened, or why? What is it that the African American Museum did or didn't do that those other museums did or didn't do, or what is it that they have or don't have?
And I think this is the question. It's almost tied up to the original question that y'all set forth, right? Of the difference between Black freedom and American sort of like the way that separation or distinction happens, right? Of like the African American Museum is in the imagination is seen as a space only for the Black community. In some ways, I enjoy that. I like that. I don't want all this sort of like mess, around that. But at the same time, if you're saying that our institutions are the stories that we tell are only, create an impact on us, now you're trying to play us. So I think that's what happens, right? Of like, we want big, quote unquote, diverse institutions, but Black institutions can't be diverse, if you know what I'm saying, right?
Well, yeah. It also feels like that because it's a quote unquote Black institution, then it's going to get supported by Black money. And I think that's the other thing. Being in the city and being funded by like having different funding streams, I think part of what I was wondering is what are the relationships to city government, and what are the relationships to the managing director's office? What are the relationships to city, state, and federal funding sources for African American institutions?
Yeah.
And is that?
Yeah, and I also want to open it up because it's not just us as like an arts and cultural institution, right? You look at Cheney, look at Lincoln, look at our Black institutions and how they are supported or abandoned, right? Depending on whose political agenda, right? And yeah, I wonder, and I think the call that we're putting forth is when you invest in the Black community, you're seeing people who have made away with the scraps.
With no way.
Made away with no way. So just imagine, and when we say we made away is when we put people on, we make sure people are housed, we make sure people are fed, we make sure people have the resources that they do. So what will happen, and I think this is the call that, the movements are leading. What happens when you put us in the lead about how we divvy up the whole pie, right? So that's how you get the call from the Philly Black Radical Collective to saying, yo, let's take away money from the PPD and then we can invest in these. Those are the priorities that our communities have always historically held, right? So I see us as connected to that and
Mm-hmm.
thinking about that from an arts and cultural perspective, but also in alignment with, like, you know what I mean, our Black organizing groups who are thinking about that across health, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think we just had 2 hospitals who would serve West Philadelphia communities closed in the past year. The one in Southwest and Hahnemann,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what? Think about all the calls that have already been, I mean, made about how we need to change the way we invest resources. So we see ourselves as connected to that, and in particular, the Paul Robeson legacy speaks to that, and it speaks to that in a deeply local way, but also in an international way, right? Because Paul Robeson and S.C. Robeson was all about, like, Black internationalism. So what is our relationship to, like, you know, anti-colonial movements across Africa? What is our relationship to growing worker struggles in Latin America? Like, so all those things are there. It's all part of how we do programming, the conversations we had, the tour, the political talk. And I know I'm about to come to a close, so I got to keep moving. But yeah, I don't know. That's where I've been at.
Yeah, no, you actually segued, and I know you got to go, but to leave us with one thing that Paul Robeson because was working on in his lifetime that you feel as though connects directly to the plight and the conditions of African Americans in this country today.
Yeah, I think the story, and just from reading the flyer that was sent, is a story that I wish had more resonance in terms of Paul Robeson and W.B. Du Bois. They weren't the only people. Alphaeus Hunton was also a huge major. His wife, Dorothy Hunton, was also there. The Council of African Affairs. And the Council of African Affairs in the 30s and 40s was a organization that came together, particularly led by African Americans, to think about how are we investing into African anti-colonial movements. And it comes out of deep relationships that Paul and Essie had, and along with other folks about like folks like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and many other sort of like African anti-colonial leaders, of like, what is our relationship to this international sort of like movement? How do we see our freedom and our liberation as bound up with theirs? And how are we bridging these stories so that people see them as interconnected? So Freedom Newspaper, which wasn't a project of the Council of African Affairs, but a project led by Louis Burnham and Paul Robeson, was a newspaper printed in the 50s that you can see that was once edited by Lorraine Hansberry, that does an amazing job of like a one-pager where you'll see a story about Kenya, you'll see a story about what's happening in Alabama, a story of what's happening in Harlem, and then a story about, you know what I mean, American imperialism in Indochina, or what will become Vietnam. All of this is on the same sort of like spread.
Yeah.
And I think about like how we get back to that. How do we get back to that global analysis where we can be, you know, specific about our local conditions, but connected in this sort of like global touch point. And just as like my little Mamiya John is back there, Mamiya Abu Jamal is a perfect sort of like example of someone who does that and who has made a connection and is loved and beloved all around the world, is making these like, and sees this sort of thing happening. So I guess like the West Philly energy of that sort of continues to live on.
Yeah, that's dope. That's dope. How much time do you have with us? I know you.
I think this is good, bro.
This is it.
I gotta
All right, man.
cook some spaghetti.
Well, listen, man. I appreciate you coming on. You know, originally he was going to come on later, but I felt like, you know, with the movement towards trying to raise funds and support towards the Paul Robeson House that was shared earlier, and you know, us coming up, this juxtaposition between Juneteenth and July 1st, I really felt like it was important to get you on. And I'm glad that you could join us a little early. I'm sorry to see you go, but you're more than welcome to come back at any point in time where we can continue the conversation.
Awesome, man. I hope somebody already put the GoFundMe in the chat. We're still ongoing. We still got sort of more critical infrastructure projects going on. And
share that. So what is the GoFundMe link, and how can people contact you, Paul?
Get onto the Facebook, John, and post it. But
Okay.
if you go to Paul Robeson House Events on Facebook, our page, you can see all the information. Or also Robeson House PHL on Twitter.
Okay. All right, Chris. Thank you so much, brother. I appreciate you.
You were incredible. Thank you, man.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't get to hear too much from you, bro, but we gonna
No,
talk.
this was your moment. Thank you. You gave everything we needed. Thank you, man.
Thanks, brothers.
All right.
Peace. Yeah. So, Ihsan, what did you think of that?
Yeah, he was awesome, man. He was awesome.
Yeah.
He spoke about some things that really touched me about like the funding and like the underrepresentation of our own historical sites. When I went to, and this is no slight on our own museum, but I noticed I went to the African American Museum down in D.C. and it was unlike anything I ever seen in my life, and it just really surprised me to see, or I was proud and surprised to see a museum in the light of just not this place full of artifacts, but an experience. And as I walked through that museum, I felt connected to our plight. I felt connected to my people. I felt connected and honored and treated in a certain way that I wish all museums do get funded that way. And I hope that people do see our history as something that matters. The same way this whole movement right now for Black Lives Matters is a trendy topic. I hope that people realize our history matters, Black history matters, and being taught properly so that movies like Hidden Figures is not a surprise story. I saw that movie a couple years ago. And I'm like, how did I never hear that Black people played a significant role in getting men to the moon? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Space travel. But these museums, I think that man, I'm just blown away. I'm stuck right now on a lot of things he said, and I'm proud. I'm proud to hear that about West Philly because it's a lot of things I just don't know. I've seen signs. I've driven by Paul Robeson house many times. I don't know much about it, to be honest. So it was really very impressive to hear him speak, and not in a way to slight him like he shouldn't be an intelligent man. He is an intelligent man. I'm just really, really grateful we got an opportunity to hear what he had to say.
Yeah, no, I'm grateful that, he's just a wealth of information, right?
Yep.
And I think, again, as you said, there's so much that is hidden from us as African Americans and our own history, that it often remains like hyper local. So we can talk about Philadelphia, and he was talking about Philadelphia, but understanding, and the thing that I appreciated the most was his understanding of being able to connect, West Philadelphia with all of Philadelphia, with all of the U.S., with the whole world, and understanding that there's a common thread there, and that, for people to talk about liberation, specifically Black people to talk about liberation, then that also inherently includes other people's liberation as well. So I just wanted to share, we also have a couple other guests that are available to join. Dr. Jose Pimienta said that he's available. He was one of our original guests. He was unfortunately running a little bit late, but I think he said he's available to join in a minute.
Okay.
And we may also be joined shortly by Robin Renee Albritton, who was a previous guest of ours as well. I think if we can take a moment, what I'll do is I just wanted to read something as we're coming up on close to the 4th of July that speaks to the purpose of this show. And while I'm reading this, Ihsan, see if you can maybe share the links and bring on the other guests. But I wanted to read this piece by Frederick Douglass. And this is starting to become, an annual sharing event of Frederick Douglass was able to write this presentation back in 1852, talking about, and the title of it is, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." And I think it's appropriate to kind of go through this and share it at this time, because we're starting to see this Black Lives Matter movement being embraced globally, but at the heart of it still remains the same things that we've been dealing with for 400 years. So I see Dr. Jose coming on now, but I wanted to read this briefly, and then we can kind of go into the rest of our discussion.
Okay.
Mr. President, friends, and fellow citizens, he who could address this audience without a quelling sensation has stronger nerves than I have. I do not remember ever to have appeared as a speaker before any assembly more shriekingly, nor with greater distrust of my ability than I do this day. A feeling has crept over me quite unfavorable to the exercise of my limited powers of speech. The task before me is one which requires much previous thought and study for its proper performance. I know that apologies of this sort are generally considered flat and unmeaning. I trust, however, that mine will not be so considered. Should I seem at ease, my appearance would much misrepresent me. The little experience I have had in addressing public meetings in country schoolhouses avails me nothing on the present occasion. The papers and placards say that I am to deliver a 4th of July oration. This certainly sounds large and out of the common way, for it is true that I have often had the privilege to speak in this beautiful hall and to address many who now honor me with their presence. But neither their familiar faces nor the perfect gauge I think I have of Corinthian Hall seems to free me from embarrassment. The fact is, ladies and gentlemen, the distance between this platform and the slave plantation from which I escaped is considerable, and the difficulties to be overcome in getting from the latter to the former are by no means slight. That I am here today is to me a matter of astonishment as well as gratitude. You will not therefore be surprised if in what I have to say, I evince no elaborate preparation nor grace my speech with any high-sounding exordium. With little experience and with less learning, I have been able to throw my thoughts hastily and imperfectly together, and trusting to your patient and generous indulgence, I will proceed to lay them before you. This, for the purpose of this celebration, is the 4th of July. It is the birthday of your national independence and your political freedom. This to you is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. It carries your minds back to the day and to the act of your great deliverance and to the signs and to the wonders associated with that act and that day. This celebration also marks the beginning of another year of your national life and reminds you that the Republic of America is now 76 years old. I am glad, fellow citizens, that your nation is so young. 76 years through a good old age for a man is but a mere speck in the life of a nation. 80 years and 10 is the allotted time for individual men, but nation numbers their years by thousands. According to this fact, you are, even now, only in the beginning of your national career, still lingering in the period of childhood. I repeat, I am glad this is so. There's hope in the thought, and hope is much needed under the dark clouds which lower above the horizon. The eye of the reformer is met with angry flashes portending disastrous times, but his heart may well beat lighter at the thought that America is young and that she's still in the impressible stage of her existence. May he not hope that high lesson of wisdom, of justice, and of truth will yet give direction to her destiny. Were the nation older, the patriot's heart might be sadder and the reformer's brow heavier. Its future might be shrouded in gloom and the hope of its prophets go out in sorrow. There is consolation in the thought that America is young. Great streams are not easily turned from channels worn deep in the course of ages. They may sometimes rise in quiet and stately majesty and inundate the land, refreshingly fertilizing the earth with their mysterious properties. They may also rise in wrath and fury and bear away on their angry waves the accumulated wealth of years of toil and hardship. They, however, gradually flow back to the same old channel and flow on as serenely as ever. But while the river may not be turned aside, it may dry up and leave nothing behind but the withered branch and the unsightly rock to howl in the abyss, sweeping wind, the sad tale of departed glory, as with rivers, so with nations. Fellow citizens, I shall not presume to dwell at length on the associations that cluster about this day. The simple story of it is that 76 years ago, the people of this country were British subjects. The style and title of your sovereign people, in which you now glory, was not then born. You were under the British crown. Your fathers esteemed the English government as the home government and England as the fatherland. This home government, you know, although a considerable distance from your home, did, in the exercise of its parental prerogatives, impose upon its colonial children such restraints, burdens, and limitations as an immature judgment. But your fathers had not adopted the fashionable idea of this day, of this infallibility of government and the absolute character of its acts presumed to differ from the home government in respect to the wisdom and justice of some of those burdens and restraints. They went so far in their excitement as to pronounce the measures of government unjust, unreasonable, and oppressive. And although such as ought not to be quietly submitted to, I scarcely need say, fellow citizens, that my opinion of those measures fully accords with that of your fathers. Such a declaration of agreement on my part would not be worth much to anybody. It would certainly prove nothing as to what part I might have taken had I lived during the great controversy of 1776. To say now that America was right and England wrong is exceedingly easy. Everybody can say it. The dastard, not less than the noble brave, can flippantly discard on the tyranny of England towards the American colonies. It's fashionable to do so, but there was a time when to pronounce against England and in favor of the cause of the colonies tried men's souls. They who did so were accounted in their day plotters of mischief, agitators, and rebels, dangerous men, to side with the right against the wrong, with the weak against the strong, and with the oppressed against the oppressor. Here lies the merit, for the one which of all others seems unfashionable in our day, the cause of liberty, may be stabbed by the men who glory in the deeds of your fathers. But to proceed. But I wanted to hold off on that because I saw Dr. Jose joined us. But as many of you may know or may not know, this letter was written by Frederick Douglass many years ago. And it's really a retort against America, talking about this celebration of the 4th of July, talking about this celebration of independence, talking about the fact that, you know, America is constantly reveling in this idea of freedom and independence, but at the same time, being a slave-holding country, being a country that actually, you know, supported slavery and supported the enslavement of Africans. And so I wanted to share a little bit about that, but I didn't want to go on too long because it's a very, very long speech. I wish I had been able to kind of like just clip out an excerpt of it, but not to take up too much more time. Let's thank, I want to thank Dr. Jose for being here. Dr. Jose, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right, brother. Brothers, I apologize for the delay. I didn't know if I was going to make it, and then I got back in time and said, let me at least jump in here for a minute. So again,
well,
I'm glad to be here.
It actually works out. It actually works out. We got a chance to talk to Christopher Rogers for a few minutes from the Paul Robeson House here in West Philadelphia. And he shared some of the work that they've been doing and carrying Paul Robeson's legacy forward, and also the cultural work in West Philadelphia from different African-centered organizations. But please do me a favor and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, I actually am an associate professor at Berea College in Kentucky, the school where Carter G. Woodson graduated before he went on to University of Chicago and to Harvard. Berea College was established to teach both quote unquote white and quote unquote Negro or colored students, 1855. I teach in African and African American studies, and I teach courses that cover both history and Black psychology. As far as my own particular focus and interest, I've done a lot of work on the history of the Moors and the African presence in Europe. I've worked with Dr. Van Sertimer, the late, great Dr. Van Sertimer. I worked with Dr. Molefi Asante and the late Dr. C. Tessalone Keto, who was a South African historian who taught at Temple University. And I guess most recently, I actually published a chapter in the Osiris Papers, which is an anthology discussing the life and work of Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. That was edited by Dr. Raymond Wu and Dr. Denise Wright. So that's a little bit about my background and where I'm at right now.
Excellent. Excellent. So, you know, one of the things, the theme of the conversation today is the juxtaposition between, you know, American independence and African-American freedom. Looking at how we are positioned directly between Juneteenth and July 4th,
Yes.
and the global movement now around the support for Black Lives Matter, George Floyd and his family, and all those who have been not just under the heel of police brutality, but just systemic oppression, specifically racial oppression. I'm not sure if you had a chance to see the email that we had sent out with some questions or overviews, but I wanted to kind of just get your thoughts about the climate where we are today, and where you see us in relation to, in a historical perspective.
I think it looks to me like we're essentially on the verge of what could be a third civil war. And as I said third, because the first would have been the American Revolution. And one of my concerns is that unless we really know the legacies and the influence of the past, the masses of people could be easily led around in any direction if they don't understand this point in time. I always talk to my students about historical literacy, right? The importance of historical literacy. So what I'm seeing on the one hand is a great desire on the part of conscientious or conscious Americans of various colors, backgrounds, to try to address what people understand are some real historic and systemic wrongs. On the other hand, I see other groups that are using this to foment more confusion, more conflict, which result in something that doesn't lead ultimately to where we're trying to go. I think the difficulty is, how do we make sense of this democratic republic, especially as African people who have been here since before the country, fought in every major war. You read, of course, the words of Frederick Douglass, and just pointing out the hypocrisy, essentially what was in place in the 19th century. And yet Douglass, as well as his own sons, believed that the US could end up in a better place. That's why his son served in the 54th Massachusetts. That's why Douglass continued to work with and speak very highly of Abraham Lincoln. And in spite of the assessments of Lincoln as not being as progressive as we would like, Lincoln was amazingly progressive for his time.
For his time. Mm-hmm.
Like, Douglass and others affirm that. Even Martin Delany, in fact, spoke well of Lincoln. So, trying to bring people to where we know they should be with 21st century sensibilities isn't fair. But to understand the context at that point, meaning these individuals saw that the country had great potential. Why? Because it had ideals that were put in place that if we lived the ideals, we could literally create a more perfect union, a nation of nationalities, because that's really what we're looking at. Mm-hmm. And a nation that was supposed to be founded on the highest principles. But unfortunately, from the start, it allowed for the continuation of chattel slavery, right? And I also like to remind folks that slavery has always existed in various cultures, including African cultures. Mm-hmm. It is true, though, to make a distinction between the chattel style slavery that existed within the Western world and the more servant-oriented slavery based upon people being prisoners of war or debtors. Essentially there was a justification of sorts for someone into that position. But when the US decided that it was going to construct a system of chattel slavery, even as it proclaimed, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, set us up for the constant battles that we're going through now. And so for me, my hope anyway, and especially being at a school like Berea, where John G. Fee, who was an Irish-American minister, part of the Methodist Church, as I recall, who was so opposed to the enslavement of African people that he sets up a school here in the heart of, let's say the heart, but certainly in the South, in Kentucky, right, which of course will be a border state during the Civil War, sets up a school dedicated to educating both, and I'm going to use other terms.
I understand.
dedicated to people of African ancestry and European ancestry. So those basically European Americans and African Americans are in an environment where they can presumably learn from each other and hopefully create a better nation. Of course, the result was he was attacked. The different people who supported it, were attacked. One of the ironies, just of this legacy too, is the great Muhammad Ali, whose name initially was Cassius Clay. Well, Cassius Clay happened to be the abolitionist from Kentucky who actually wanted gradual emancipation and was opposed to the continuation of slavery. So what I'm getting at is there have always been these kind of fits and starts, and we're seeing these lessons. The reason I point that out is I think a lot of times we don't always understand that the present events are not as clearly understood unless you see the context of the progression, right? Mm-hmm. The digression, stepping forward and then being pushed back, stepping forward and moving back. But ultimately, the purpose, I would argue, is to get people to see the common ground, right, between different peoples. Mm-hmm. Reasons why I focus so much on the African presence in Europe and focus on the history of the Moors is because part of envisioning something different requires us to know that there are historical precedents or prototypes that are already there. Mm-hmm. We're talking about ancient Kemet, and of course we had to reclaim Kemet because Kemet had been whitewashed or Europeanized. Mm-hmm. But once that was reclaimed and people of African ancestry started to say, well, wait a minute, even Europeans and Asians understood that African people established great legacies. We're not the wards of the world. We're not the stepchildren of the world. We, in fact, are at the seat or the foundation of what becomes human civilization. Mm-hmm. People only see us in the context of slavery, chattel slavery. Mm-hmm. It's hard for them to envision us as being able to achieve what they would deem as the appropriate level of civilization.
So let me jump in here because I mean you've given us a lot of information in a small period of time, but something that you said about how we are seen, how people of African descent and Africans themselves are seen as the wards of the world, right? Why is it that we are sitting here 21st century, but we are still dealing with mindsets and belief systems that are 18th century, 19th century?
Right. Excellent.
What is it that's causing that cognitive dissonance and this is going to be blunt, like white America, mm-hmm. or Western thinking that allows these systems to continue?
Because of it is systemic racism, or it is systemic anti-Black or anti-African thought, right? It's been put within the very foundation of what it is to be not only an American, but what it is essentially be part of the Western world. Mm-hmm. When we say Western, we're saying that our worldview is centered on essentially on Europe as always holding anteriority. It's always out front. The fact that we're products of Western education speaks to that as well, right? For the most part, right? We've been raised and educated in the West. So given that our history programs, our religious views, case in point, why is it that people are still confused about, and I'm talking about within the African American community, are confused, maybe not so much now, but about the identity of even someone like a Jesus, right? Where you can still go or have conversations with young African American students, and their perception of God, if you will, is still a European. So contributes to this idea that there's something less valuable about being of African descent. Then we have a history which largely emphasizes only the legacy of slavery, or at best, the legacy of the civil rights struggle. So we frame our reality within the context of being slaves and then fighting for human rights, as if there isn't a whole legacy of thousands of years of contributions to the world, be it through Kemet, be it through the Moors, be it through the kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, or be it through the contributions Africans made here in the Americas. So I would say that the reason for that is our educational system hasn't done a very good job of changing that. But let me add another part of that. One of the things that's always troubled me is how many of us have waited for the mainstream educational system to teach us about ourselves. That never made any sense, right? The Jewish people, the Jewish community is understood because of the legacy of being attacked by, if you will, the Gentile community, set up Hebrew schools. They made sure that they funded and taught their young men and women what it was to be Jewish, the legacy of the Jewish people. Needless to say, we as African peoples should have been and need to be doing the same thing, right? There are examples of it in the free African schools in the 18th century. There are examples of it that would come up periodically, even something like during the period of the Black Panthers, right? And a lot of other examples of charter schools. But there is not the kind of concerted focus effort from the community at large to see the importance of doing just that.
So let me ask you this. Do you feel like that is a result? This is a leading question because this is, but do you feel like that failure or lack of doing it cohesively is a result of being separated from our identity as Africans? Because when you talk about the Jewish community, there is a continuation of legacy and history and culture and understanding that their religious practices are inextricably tied to their cultural practices and their identity. So is that, how can we overcome something like that when our identity has been stripped from us?
I think part of it is to begin by first calling ourselves Africans, to recognize that we're Africans in the diaspora, we're Africans in the Americas, in spite of what Africans from the continent may say, right? Because I've had people tell me, well, you know, Doc, I tried that, and I was talking to someone who was from wherever, I won't name the country, different countries, but they'll say, and they told me, you're not African, you're Black. And I said to them, what does Black mean? Where are your ancestors from, right? The fact that you're a person of African ancestry born in the Americas doesn't negate the fact that you're still an African, right? I think it was Malcolm who said, if a cat has kittens in an oven, they're not biscuits, right? So it should be clear to us that being of African ancestry, we're still of African ancestry. Asians don't call themselves yellows once they hit the Western world. They don't refer to themselves as yellow Americans. They don't, we're for affirming the value of being yellow. They affirm the value of being Asian in general or specific to their particular Asian community. Now, people can make the case, well, but understand, we don't know where we're from exactly, right? We can't identify being from China or Thailand or India or wherever. No, but you know that you are of African ancestry, so you can start there. And amazingly, in fact, now we even have Ancestry.com where you can trace your DNA and they can tell you, well, actually, yeah, you do have roots in this part of Africa.
We have AfricanAncestry.com, not to make this a commercial, but they're even more specific.
Right. I just use that as an example, of course, because that particular company is one that gets most of the attention.
Exactly.
I've met Brother Rick Kittles, who was responsible, worked with the Human Genome Project. I don't know if you know.
Yes, I'm familiar.
Right. So African-American, brother who worked on the Human Genome Project some 20 years ago. But this process of changing that is affirming first who we are. But I'll say again, this goes back to the psychology of it all. We generally don't feel comfortable, I'm speaking again in general, affirming our African ancestry. And what's so bizarre is I've had people attack me because I say, I don't identify with being Black. I don't use that term. I understand if people use it in general reference to me, I'm not going to browbeat somebody for making that point, but I'll correct and say, well, brother or sister, I identify as a person of African ancestry or an African. And I don't use that term. If you want to use it, that's fine. If you want a reason why I don't, then we can have a conversation. But one of the primary reasons is it keeps moving us away from what we're trying to affirm. Right? We're trying to affirm the fact that we're African people. Africa, vast cultures, contributions to human civilization, just call it. But the fact that we are uncomfortable with that is one of the primary reasons. Then, like I said, we have an educational system that largely presents us as wards, slaves, always fighting for civil rights or human rights, and nothing else that has any value or depth.
But isn't it the educational system that creates that mindset that makes people not want to identify as Africans?
It can, although think about what the whole discipline of Africana studies or Black studies, if you will, or African American studies, the whole purpose behind that was to affirm, to resurrect, right? Dr. Milena Karanga, who has been talking about this for some 50 years, right? The idea of using Africa as a resource and not just a reference, right? So we've had institutions with some of the best minds, I named a few earlier, who were dedicated to telling the truth about our history and our legacy. But the support for that is only as great as the people who come to it. And so if you have people in the public educational system and in the community at large who are not aware of the value of it, right? I'll give an anecdotal example. When I was in graduate school, I had a colleague who was from New Orleans, and this brother, we were all getting to know each other. And this brother was saying, when he told his family members what he'd be doing, he said, yeah, I actually start a doctoral program come, August, late August. And this is someone who's African-American, undoubtedly of African ancestry. And he said this to his uncle, and his uncle said, what are you going to be studying? He said, African-American history, African-American studies. Forgive my language, but he said his uncle said to him, shit, boy, I could teach about niggas. That's telling us where a lot of our minds are at. Now, on the one hand, his uncle was, if you will, honest and kind enough to open up and tell him his truth. A lot of us delude ourselves. We're not being honest about how we feel or think about ourselves. And I understand it, because if you have been bombarded with a whole bunch of negativity, it's hard to break through that unless you seek the knowledge of yourself. And again, back to Nile Valley civilization. Know thyself. There's nothing more important than that, right? But what has been conveyed to us by the overwhelming, majority within our society, within Western institutions, has been the negation or devaluation of what it is to be of African ancestry. And as you said, Brother Eric, the educational system is often the problem. But we do have, quote unquote, higher education, where that should be the environment for us to address just that. And let me just add one other thing real quick. I understand people can have multiple, or I should say, see multiple aspects of their identity, right? I've often asked my students, you can identify first as someone who's of African ancestry, or you might identify first as being someone who's from Alabama. You might identify first as being a man or a male. You might identify first as being a Christian, right? We're made up of multiple identities in that sense. But my point is, if you're trying to correct the conditions that face African peoples universally, that has to be your focus. Your focus should be on how can I elevate and ameliorate the conditions of African peoples, male or female.
So here's my question. I'm glad you led to that, right? So because we talk about the conditions of African people, and I'm going to use George Floyd as an example. George Floyd didn't lay down on that ground and die of natural causes, right?
Right.
We're living in a system where there are active oppressors. Like there's not only is it a system, but there are people perpetuating that system. So what role does, or what responsibility, or what component does white America or the Western world play in this whole conversation about Black consciousness, Black liberation, education? What's the responsibility that lies over there?
I think the responsibility goes back to my initial point about know thyself, or know the institutions that one has inherited. In this chapter, and also in an article that I wrote in the Western Journal of Black Studies, where I raised this issue of national character and American policing. And by national character, what is the collective character or consciousness of what it is to be an American? What things, what historical events have shaped that? And I look at studies in psychology, and I look at the historical record to try to make sense of why so many quote unquote white folks think and act certain ways. Now, of course, what's interesting is, I don't know if this was true, but I thought I read day before yesterday or 2 days ago, some Pew Foundation poll said that the vast majority of the people who are out here protesting and pulling down the statues are quote unquote white folks. Meaning a lot of these same young people of European ancestry are the ones taking the lead in this, right? I would say that those who were doing it have already had some level of awareness in their minds where they're saying, we really have to do something to change this system. They've decided this is wrong, and kudos to them. Now we're talking about, if you will, the family of humanity, or the family of man, right? That's what ultimately I would like to imagine we're trying to get to. But then here's the other side. There is, or there are, those who I would suggest are committed to not allowing any equity. Because if they allow equity, down the road, it means, to put it in Cress-Welsing terms, genetic annihilation. Now, I make a distinction. I happen to take the position that I don't believe every person who is identified as white thinks or feels that way. But I do think that there are those within the so-called white community who do. When you think of people like Richard Spencer, who's come right out and said it, as part of the alt-right, and others who take the position, we don't want a warm and fuzzy America. We don't want a nation that's a melting pot, because if there's a melting pot, we disappear. So I think on the one level, there are those in the quote unquote white community who are beyond that, who are thinking on a higher level of consciousness, or if you will, spiritual development. And then those who are resonating, if you will, at a much lower frequency, are thinking only in terms of self-preservation, right? And the maintenance of the country as a quote unquote white man's country. And when they think white man, they mean European man, who are of predominant European descent.
So, yeah, it kind of leaves us in a situation because, for me, I think one of the purposes of this conversation, what I wanted to get at was, what can we do as African Americans, as people who are from the African diaspora, to elevate not only our consciousness, but ensure that we are not just surviving this system, but thriving in it. So it's, whether that means to dismantle it, to undermine it, what sort of suggestions do you have? Because here's the thing, when you mentioned Africana studies, you mentioned higher learning, you know, the thing that came to mind was, what's the average age of a person that when they encounter those things, when you go to college and you decide to study African, you've been on this earth for at least 18 to 20 years.
Right.
So what needs to happen for us to kind of ingrain this at an earlier age? Similar to what you were saying about the university that you're teaching at, the school that you're teaching at, and its founding in educating Black and white side by side. What are some of your thoughts about, like, where do we go from here and what we need to do?
What we need is the collective involvement of the community in changing the public school system. That's what we need. Greater participation from those in our community in changing the public school system, changing the curricula that are used to teach history, be it world history and US or American history. Because as you said, brother man, that's really where it starts, right? We're talking about getting into the educational system and doing so honestly. You know, I'm not a proponent of presenting things that I know are historically indefensible. There are many things that are historically defensible about our legacy and contribution, and there should be no controversy around it. Bringing that into the school system is a huge start. I also happen to be a huge proponent of trying to get more of those of us who are involved in entertainment, be it sports, to start using our financial resources to produce films, TV shows, public service announcements. I mean, just bombard the media with different images of who we are in ways that are reaching the youngest right on up to our elders, right? That's how we got to this point. And again, to use the analogy going back to the Jewish community. The Jewish community in the early 20th century, I'm forgetting the name of the author, but the book was called An Empire of Our Own, talked about how the Jewish community, knowing they were under such assault, started to get control of Hollywood for the purpose of presenting favorable images, to be able to change the narrative about who they were and to create a greater sense of tolerance, right? Greater sense of respect for that diversity. And all those things, I would say, are lessons that a lot of us don't necessarily learn. And, you know, it isn't like we don't have the financial resources, right? We have the financial resources. Generally, what has happened is we don't have those who have the financial resources being of like minds, saying, we're going to make that investment to make these things happen and not be concerned about whether we're seen as leaving somebody out, so to speak. Look, we have to do something to change the image. Like, again, using an example, I often say to my students, Africa and African peoples have an image problem. It isn't a problem of history not showing our greatness, our contributions in the sciences, our contributions in culture in general, right? Our brilliance. The fact that that is not generally known is largely the effect, as you can imagine, students will say, well, I've seen Africa today. Out of those 54 or 55 countries, how many of them are really manifesting the best in terms of technologies, infrastructure, and everything else? And I will say you're correct. There are problems with infrastructure involving the African continent as well. But then you have to begin that same course of action. Know thyself. Study the reasons why. Understand the these are things that are the result of certain forces that don't want it to happen. This is why someone as great as Marcus Garvey, who took the best of what Booker T. Washington was conveying and then took it international and stepped up, right, with the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League. That was the part that's often left out of the, right? And this was intended to change the educational system, the business arena, religion. All of those things were impacted by Garvey. But because Garvey was too successful, he was seen as a threat, of course, to early 20th century global Eurocentric hegemony that we customarily called white supremacy.
And so, you know, you said something about, you know, us Africans having a image problem, right? But isn't what comes to mind is you talk about stories. You know, my sister Denise Valentine was an accomplished storyteller, and we always talked about the power of stories. And one of the things that she did was, you know, ensuring that children understood their stories. But also think about the fact that, similar to what you were saying about hegemony, the white hegemony and that global power structure, it makes me think of going all the way back to the birth of Hollywood and birth of a nation, right? And that it's not just the fact that we're not telling our own stories. There is an active PR campaign to smear people of African diaspora. So again, it's like these two things are happening simultaneously. How do we address both sides? Or can we address those both sides? Or are we addressing both sides just simply by telling our story?
I would say we're addressing both sides by simply telling our story. We're always going to have opposition, right? There's always going to be opposition to these efforts. What may be different now, and this goes back again, of course, to why you have gathered us together for this. It may be that because of the heightened awareness, the in-your-face events that took place with George Floyd, where people cannot deny this anymore, right? That started to wake people up in many ways. I don't know what an equivalent could be. Something like in terms of the Civil War, the firing on Fort Sumter, that was like, wow, things have really changed. It began to galvanize, of course, South versus North. And in this case, it's kind of galvanizing those in the more conscious and spiritually aware and awake communities versus those who are still holding on to old conceptions of what this reality is supposed to be. So I think what we can think of in terms of something favorable, or the good news, if you will, is that there does appear to be a level of consciousness as we muster greater support for these efforts, which doesn't have to do with burning down anything or destroying anything, saying, look, media, we need to start focusing on changing the image and the narrative in the media, right? We need to change our educational system so that the curricula represent it. And what's amazing is, and this goes back to your point as well, we were making a lot of progress in the late 80s and early 90s with a level of awareness. That's why there was pushback, right, from those in certain academic arenas because of the success of that, where they said, wait a minute, these people are starting to make headway. And part of it was the reclaiming of Kemet. But there were other things that, in fact, there was a, what was that called? The Socialization of the Culturally Diverse Child conference that was held in the early 90s, like 1990. And these were public school educators from all over the country who came together to address the idea of how do you educate culturally diverse populations. And guess what? It was highly successful. I happened to be one of the young academics at the time, just coming out of grad school, who was asked to speak to social studies teachers in St. Louis, Missouri, and in Ohio on how to incorporate the African presence and the history of the Moors in their curricula. So that first introduction that young African-American children or African diasporan children or African children had of their legacy was not, oh yeah, here you are, slavery. We'll get to you in a minute, right? That worked. The problem was it worked too well. And the other problem was if you don't have parents, if you don't have the community at large, keeping tabs on what's going on, after a few years, they took it out. Well, we have to cover these other things in the curriculum, right? It was for a while, but then when no one was looking, they pulled it, right? So essentially, that means that we, those in the African American community or the African diaspora community, have to be more dedicated to staying on point with this, right? And calling upon the best minds in education and in scholarship to go in and change these curricula, right? And calling on the best minds to change the narrative of who we are in film, in TV shows, etc. So that's, and I know I got the little message that came up, so we only have a few minutes, so I'll stop there.
No. That was a great summary, because I think it does leave us with actionable items, right? It gives us a thing to do. And that is, one, don't rest on your laurels. Just because you achieve a victory, conquer that hill, don't give it up once you've reached that point. But also understanding that, again, for me, and I'm glad we were able to take this conversation back to childhood education, because again, educating both Black and white children side by side with the same curriculum that actually highlights the achievement of Africans, I think is one of the most valuable and direct ways. But again, we've got ingrained adults. It's the adults that's the problem, right? Racism is not something that's for as far as we know, it's not something born in your DNA. It's something that's taught and it's perpetuated, and it's often from the adults to the children. So that's again, I think that's the reason why I keep going back to this focus on white America, Western culture. Not that, there's a lot of people that say, oh, we don't need them at all. There's nothing, I don't want them involved in any kind of way. But when there's an active system at play that is miseducating them just as much as we're being miseducated.
Exactly.
And there's a system of like access to resources and just sheer numbers, access to organizations and institutions and policies. That lies at the heart for me of why this needs to be a conversation with both sides at the table.
I agree. Absolutely.
Excellent. Ihsan, is there anything that you wanted to jump in and share? I know we're coming up on our time here.
I actually wanted to ask the doctor a question about education. How do you feel about the educational resources that are virtual, such as like using YouTube or any other type of resource? The reason I asked that is because I don't know if you can really verify how true things are. I watched a documentary on YouTube this past week about eugenics, and it was kind of blowing my mind to really understand like a lot of the things that Hitler was putting into play with the Holocaust, he was getting from some people who were in America over some of our systems that led to Planned Parenthood and a genetic attack on Black America.
That's right.
I'm not really sure, how do you verify, one, if these resources are real when they're on YouTube, and do you find them to be valuable if they are?
That's an excellent question. I've often said there's so much information now available on YouTube, you could almost do a graduate degree if you know where to go, right? If you know where to go. Probably the easiest way for me to answer that is to say, look at who the people are who are being interviewed. Look to see if they provide any sort of bibliographic information, right? As opposed to somebody just talking off the top of their heads. So that's probably the easiest answer I can give for being able to figure it out. So absolutely, I believe that YouTube can be valuable, but also YouTube puts out a lot of crap, and being able to separate the crap from the gold, so to speak, requires paying attention to who the people are who are speaking, and follow up is, who is this person? Is this an academic, or is someone who, whether they have a PhD or not, is it someone who is a scholar who's dedicated any attention to this, so that I can discern how much to take from it? And then, of course, then it's incumbent upon you or any of us to then go and follow up and do additional research.
That was exactly what I was looking for, because I know everyone doesn't have to have a certain level of education to have experience, but I do know that there are some things that I need to find out about what I'm consuming. But also I realize, like, young people consume, my children watch YouTube and TikTok, and they're on social media a lot. So my reason for asking is, how do you get them to learn where they already are? And when you talked about the higher education being a means of where you actually educate people to learn systems and everything differently, systemically, some people may not actually get out of high school to reach a certain level of education. So what I've been concerned about is, how do you educate people where they are if they're not actually getting an opportunity to go on to higher education, if economically their environment has them choosing to go sell drugs or choosing anything. I'm sorry actually for even labeling it that, because that's not our only path. Just like you said, slavery and civil rights is not our only history. There's other reasons for struggle that are out there as well. And I'm really grateful. I'm going to sum this up with just saying I'm really grateful for everything that you had to say today. You didn't just highlight the problem, but you really offered a lot of history. You also labeled some really good, or identified some really good solutions and steps that we could take. And I'm African now. I've never really thought about it like the way you talked about Asians. Asians don't identify themselves the same way. Right. They may call themselves Korean or anything, but they go by their heritage, and we do know that we're from Africa.
Right, because they affirm it. They're saying there's no shame in calling themselves Asian, right? They may then be specific, and so, but like I said, they don't identify themselves as yellows. So use the analogy of colors, right? So it's all about color. Well, really, of course, someone of European ancestry is going to identify themselves as white. There's a whole neuro-linguistic aspect to that, right? There's a whole neuro-linguistic aspect to why one would identify themselves as white, because white is, in the English language, associated with everything that's pure and divine and good, right? So, but then if you scratch the surface, well, my people are German, or my people are Irish, or my people are English. They'll then tell you, but yet we as African peoples, generally under the designation of Black, seem to be uncomfortable with affirming our African heritage. And there's nothing to be ashamed of for being African. You're going to find Africans who are great achievers and Africans who weren't great achievers. But that's true of Asians, it's true of Europeans, it's true of Native Americans, Australian Aborigines, right? And I'm sure for those on other planets, it's probably true of them too, right? So basically, this is part of the process of recognizing, who we are.
So you just brought up, you just made me think of another question. I got to get this out because I think it speaks to the heart of like the purpose of this conversation, right? How do we reconcile identifying ourselves as Africans when we know that our experience as Africans in America is solely unique, and we are, as much as we may be and want to be connected to the motherland, to the continent, that our experience as African Americans is a wholly unique experience and separates us from every other African that's alive today?
Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans have been here since the 1850s and 1860s.
Mm-hmm.
They continue to identify themselves as Japanese, even if they don't speak Japanese. I know I have friends, and that's also true of people who are Chinese. They still acknowledge they're Chinese, but they're saying, I'm Chinese, but I'm actually a Christian. Or I'm Japanese, but I'm actually a Christian, right? So this goes back to my point again earlier when I quoted Malcolm. Being in a new environment shouldn't negate who we are at our core.
Mm-hmm.
We're expressing our African selves differently in the Americas because we've had a different experience.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no reason for us to deny that we're still of African ancestry.
Mm-hmm.
That's the point, that I'm making. But
Yeah.
you're correct. Our experience is not the same as a Nigerian or a Ghanaian or an Ethiopian, right? Or any other community per se that represents, African peoples and cultures on the continent.
Mm-hmm.
But by saying that, and here's the hope, because when people have studied, for example, African American culture, from how we speak our language, Ebonics, to our respect, well, let me put it this way, to the idea of the respect for the elders,
Mm-hmm.
to the idea of pouring libations to those who've passed on.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody, open up some whatever they're drinking, regardless,
Yeah.
and pour libations to someone.
Well, in the hood they say pour out a little liquor, but it
Right.
is.
That's what I was trying to avoid that, but thank you.
No, that's what it is. And so
make it plain. That's right. That's
yeah,
right.
make it plain.
So, and these are all aspects of our African roots, even our expression in religion. Even as we adopted Christianity, it was an African expression of Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or an African expression of Islam.
Mm-hmm.
So we have different African expressions under these new conditions, but that doesn't mean we give up Africa. This is
Exactly
that I'm making.
Exactly.
And what has happened is we've allowed very often brothers and sisters from the continent to tell us we shouldn't identify as African because we're not like them. Let me be very clear about something though. Many times Africans from the continent, because I have many students who are from African countries, and they'll say to me, they'll say, Dr. Bey, I agree with you, and I certainly see you as African because of how you conduct yourself. You're respectful. You are pleasant in terms of, you can have a conversation, you respect other people. You're not walking around with your pants falling down around your behind. You're reflecting the best of what it is. You respect elders, and they'll hear me when I talk about people who are older. In other words, reflecting those values, right? Consciously. So what it's requiring of us too is to clean up our own act in ways that we also show that respect for our sisters and brothers, right? That affirm all those African origins
Mm-hmm.
that we know are in us, right? I mean the values and the practices. If we're not going to adhere to that, then we become indeed something else.
Mm-hmm.
We become Made in America Negroes, or the translation of negro in Spanish is black. So we become Made in America Blacks, or Made in America Negros, as opposed to African people in the Americas, different expression, but nevertheless an expression of our Africanness that affirms our value and lives up to the nobility that we represent.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I think that we can end it on that. I feel like one of the best ways to sum it up. I'm a lot of people that I know I'm a visual thinker, and I think if we can simply describe it in a way that explains that our experience here in America, we are just a branch of the
Exactly.
tree that has grown out of Africa. And that doesn't mean we're disconnected in any kind of way. We can still maintain, as a matter of fact, if we maintain those roots, we're a stronger, healthier branch that is then able
Exactly.
to produce fruit. So
That was, forgive me for interrupting you, that was Marcus Garvey's agenda, right? That was the All African People's Party agenda. There was a group known as the All African People's Party. In fact, they were in Philadelphia back in the early 90s. The All African People's Party. And these were brothers and sisters that affirmed, so we're African peoples in the Americas. But the problem is, again, we understand there are forces that want to divide and conquer, divide and rule. Once we start thinking collectively about our Africanness and its various expressions and saying we're Africans, other folks who've been trying to prevent that are in big trouble. Then we're more conscious of our power, right? We have people still thinking that the largest population on the planet are Europeans, quote unquote whites. Europeans are the minority on the planet. The largest population are people who are Asian, followed by Africans.
yes.
But we wouldn't even know it because we equate Black with minority. And then it's affirmed minority.
Well, and also we're not telling that story.
Exactly.
It's someone else telling that story. So that African proverb about, you know, when lions have their own storyteller,
Right.
I think it sums up.
Right. Then the lion is the hero as opposed to the hunter.
As opposed to the hunter. Exactly. Well,
As
thank
a
you.
main thinking, it's just to constantly have you think in a particular way. Even the narrative that comes out of our government when we had the uprisings last month from the George Floyd, the label that immediately came out of the White House were these thugs. And if you can consider yourself a thug, your identity is damaged, and maybe your behavior will actually go that way. They hope that they can get that to be our label. And even if it's not for us to behave that way, for other people to identify and treat us that way. So if the narrative can be these thugs are out there giving a call to the police to treat us as thugs, to treat us as criminals. I was reading, well, on that documentary, it was bothering me how they didn't just label us as Black people. They actually labeled us as like imbeciles. It was ways to just bring us down to the lowest level of humanity. And it's just heartbreaking to see some of the things that our identities have been scarred, man. Like our identities have really been scraped, but we're not an evil people. I watched this clip from Donahue show that was featuring Louis Farrakhan. It may be from the 80s or the 90s, but he was talking about how white America, or the people who are the oppressor, are afraid of us doing to them what they've done to us. And that's not how we think. We're not like that. We just want to be treated equal. But we're people of a village. We're people of sharing, and people of empowering one another, encouraging one another. And I hope that everyone out there who has heard something today from Christopher and also from Dr. Jose, that you've heard something that could be very encouraging to you and help you to strive to learn more about your identity. I know I've been challenged to do that. I've sat here, I've listened for most of this, and it's been really encouraging to hear what you've had to say. Do you have any type of classes that people could take online? I know you said you're in Kentucky, but do you have anything you can learn here in Philadelphia, or
any resources?
Actually, at this point, I don't have any classes that I'm teaching online, although I keep getting requests to do an online course. And I actually am going to put that on my to-do list for this fall.
Okay.
As far as resources, I mentioned before, if anybody wants to read anything that I have written, of course, you know, they can search my last name. The latest work is the one in the Western Journal of Black Studies that's specific to what's happening right now. And that's, it's called National Character, Policing, right? National Character and Policing, Some Insights from Black Psychology. And that's in the Western Journal of Black Studies from last year, or 2018. So that way you can kind of get a sense of framing part of what I've talked about in terms of what national character is and how it affects American policing and the idea of our, the collective American identity, et cetera. And then the other is the work of the late, great elder Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. And then I also have done quite a bit of work on the history of the Moors. Othello's Children in the New World is actually a book that I wrote quite a few years ago, but I'm working on a second edition of that, Othello's Children in the New World. And it's looking specifically at Moorish history and Moorish identity. So those are some places to start.
Some more resources. Do you have a website or anything?
I don't have a website. And, it's so funny. I've been asked to set up, Twitter?
Yes.
I've been asked to do, are you on Facebook?
Mhm.
It's like, as busy as I am, I literally just don't have time to do as much as I would like.
Okay.
Probably need to hire, some assistants and secretaries or something so I can do all this. But I don't.
Well, I'll share. I'll just let you know. I did share your faculty page with our viewers who are watching on Facebook, so people can find you there. And I'll be sure to share a link to your book one of your books. I know you have more than one, but be able to share that information as well, so people can find you.
Okay. All right.
And again, I just want to say thank you again so much for coming on. I know you were in a rush, a lot of stuff going on, but
yes,
it all worked out. It all worked out. So thank you for being able to stay on.
You're welcome.
Appreciate
Thank you all. Brother Ihsan, it's a pleasure. Thank you for your comments as well.
Thank you.
And Brother Eric, it's a pleasure.
If you ever need anything, you have us. MBK Cares is here for the community. And if there's any content you have that your assistants in the future, whoever helps you create this content, we'll put it out there. Like, you've done enough tonight to convince myself and Eric. We didn't come here to be convinced. We came here to talk to you. But I'm convinced that I'm willing to share anything that you want to provide to our audience and to our community. We are a mental health organization, and these things are important for our mental health identity.
Yes.
Most of the things that inspire us mentally are not knowing who we are, not knowing that we're made for significance. And when people
know thyself,
know thyself.
Yep.
That's right.
So I'm very, very grateful for the viewing audience out there on Facebook, on Zoom, on YouTube. This is our final episode of MBK Cares Wellness Wednesday for season 1. We'll be returning on Wednesday, July 29th at 6 p.m. We have not discussed, or we have not decided yet what the subject will be for that night. But this is Minority Mental Health Month. For the rest of this month, we'll be focusing our efforts on partnering with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. We'll have training sessions that'll be going on beginning next Thursday, July 9th. We'll follow it up on the 16th, the 23rd, and the 30th will be our final training for this month. Those sessions are for teenagers and for adults, and they're going to be, they won't be displayed on Facebook. They'll be private on Zoom, and there'll be limited seating or limited viewers for 25 registration slots at a time. So we thank you all for riding this pandemic out with us. We thank you for going on a journey to understand our mental health better. We touched on fatherhood, we touched on motherhood, we touched on suicide prevention, finances, our diet, our education from home. And now here we are talking about what it is to live in the dilemma of the American independence and African American freedom. And I think we've done a great job, and we've had some great guests. Thank you again, Doctor. Thank you, Eric, for being a strong man for us and for MBK Cares. And thank you all for listening to us. We hope that you have a peaceful night. Thank you very much. God bless.
Thank you.
God bless. Thank you, Tom.
Peace.